to cooking. The next week he doesn't cook, and people decide, well, I guess it's not worth it anymore. You know, I'm sure people will wander in. That's how it always works. All right, if you got your Bibles, open to the book of Ruth. Finish this book. Hey Cam, would you mind giving me that whiteboard? I forgot I intended to use it. I bet it's in that back left classroom. Is it not in that back left classroom? Look in the back, straight back classroom. It's in somebody's classroom. Back right classroom. Probably not. Maybe it is. Okay, so we looked at the book of Ruth last time, spent time on Ruth, and we talked about that the main idea, or at least certainly one of the main ideas for us to see in the book of Ruth, is that God is never mentioned by the narrator by name, at least as being active. He's kind of mentioned in passing a few times. Oh, yeah. But, yeah, we did. That's why I'm reviewing that right now. And what we saw was that the story of Ruth, we have all of these what seem to be coincidences that have to line up just right for the story to work out right. And all these coincidences do line up exactly like they're supposed to, so that at the end of the story, we find out that Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David and thus in the line of Jesus, one of the women that's in the line of Christ. And we talked about how comforting it is as Christians to know that nothing really happens by chance. There are no real coincidences in that way, that we're not going to miss some divine appointment, that God's story that He is writing of all of history will not be messed up by us making the wrong decision, whatever it is, that we can rest in God. Talked about there being three main characters in the book, that being Naomi, the widow, who is brought back her joy, as her name is changed back from bitterness to Naomi. Ruth, the Moabite woman, and Boaz, the farmer. We talked about how the book of Ruth happens in the period of the Judges, which we realize in the first verse of the book. Basic story is Naomi's husband dies, Ruth's husband dies, Naomi's other son dies, and so Naomi and Ruth find themselves back in Jerusalem and find themselves in pretty dire straits without anyone to really watch over them. They seem to be basically homeless. And so, as was the rule in Jerusalem, the poor were able to glean or to go into the harvest fields and take the scraps that fell while the harvesters were reaping. And so Naomi sends Ruth out into the field to glean barley, and it just so happens that she ends up in the field of Boaz, and it just so happens that Boaz notices her, and it just so happens that Boaz is the kinsman redeemer of Ruth's family. We spent a little time talking about what that means. That's what we'll be focusing on today. So we have this sort of redemption story of Naomi, who thinks that God is against her, but in reality, God is working all these things out, so she ends up being in the line of Jesus in some real sense, and of course being the great-grandmother of King David. All of these mundane events, if you're reading the Old Testament, you get to Ruth, you're reading the story, and you think, well, this is a cool story, but why in the world is it in here? Why in the world is this story of this individual woman in here? But you realize, of course, that it's part of God's great narrative, story of the whole world, and that our stories are no different. That your story is being woven into the story of God, just like Ruth's story, and that though you may not see what God is doing, God is writing your story, and nothing is happening by chance. We said that quote, that God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, and you might be aware of 3 of them. And the idea of us being the child in the back seat who's telling the father that he's turning the wrong way in the car when the child doesn't even know where he's going, that very often that's us. And that we see in this story of the book of Ruth, and Ruth's story, that all of these things that don't seem to make sense, that she loses her husband, and she loses her sons, and Ruth loses her young husband, and all these problems, and they end up in poverty, and end up in homelessness. And we see all these things working together, both for their good and for the glory of God, of course, in the ultimate story that He is writing. And our stories are no different than that. So it's a story of just so happens when nothing just so happens. Okay, so this idea, as we've been going through the Old Testament, we've talked about the crimson threads that are woven from Genesis to Malachi. This is one of them. Another reason the book of Ruth exists in the canon is this idea of kinsman redeemer. Kinsman just meaning family redeemer. And the idea was, it was a way to care for widows in the Old Testament and children in the Old Testament, is that when a widow became a widow, that those in her family were to care for her, watch out for her. in the ultimate sense, were to redeem her, which means to purchase. It's a financial idea, to redeem. The fact that we were redeemed by Christ means that we were purchased by Christ's blood. We're no longer our own. We were bought with a price. Kinsman redeemer was the male in the family who would redeem or purchase the woman and children of a man who had died in order to care for them. So Ruth ends up in the field of this man who happens to be the kinsman redeemer for Naomi's family. And as they have returned homeless, he would be one of the ones that would be looking out for them, all of those things. We mentioned in the beginning, but it's crucial to the story that you remember that Ruth is a Moabite woman. She's not Israelite, she's Moabite. And if you remember, Moab has a pretty rough history, certainly in the Bible. They were a nation probably founded by incestuous relationships, and then they were a people that led the Israelites away from God and caused 25,000 men to be killed because of the Moabite women leading them astray. And so to be a Moabite, particularly to be a Moabite woman, was to be, in the eyes of the Israelite, scandalous. And to marry a Moabite woman was a great wrong. And yet, despite all of these things, God uses a Moabite woman in the line of Christ. The key to this story being Ruth, a Moabite woman. So, Ruth comes back to Israel with Naomi in this dire situation, meets Boaz, the whole thing happens. Look at chapter 2, verse 4. Ruth chapter 2, verse 4. Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Perhaps there's a foreshadowing there as well, a crimson thread. Boaz, this kinsman redeemer, comes from Bethlehem. What I want us to see, you probably realize this, what I want us to see is how Boaz points to Christ. Okay, that Christ is the ultimate kinsman redeemer. That we are seeing in Boaz a foreshadowing of that which Christ will do for us. He is a type in that way of Christ. So Boaz comes from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young men who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." I love that he says it twice. Moabite woman who came from the country of Moab. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So we are introduced to this idea and this relationship of Boaz and the kinsman redeemer. Okay, so the things I want us to see in this foreshadowing of Christ is the kinsman redeemer seeks the destitute to make them family. Okay, we have this idea of Boaz, the one in power, the one with the authority, the one with the wealth, who seeks out the one who is destitute, in this case, the homeless Moabite woman. Okay, it's hard to express how absurd the idea is that a land-owning Israelite of wealth and of status would take note of and care about a homeless, going after the reapers because of her poverty, Moabite woman, right? She has all the categories that makes her undesirable. And yet, Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, seeks after this Moabite woman. Look at verse 8. Boaz says to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." As you can probably imagine, there was a great threat of harm to these women, especially young women who were in this role, who were homeless, who were in great need, who were gleaning after the reapers. There was harm of their abuse. And so Boaz says, "Don't go to another field, stay here. You're welcome here. You'll be taken care of here." Verse 9, "Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you?" And there's a reference to that. "I've charged the young men not to touch you, the one with all the power. And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Verse 10, here's... Again, it's often difficult to feel the weight of the culture when we're so far away from that culture. But Ruth's response gives you a hint. "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, a Moabite, since I am a foreigner?'" Right? The way Boaz is treating her in the modern day, which is so foundationally Christian, which says, of course you take care for the poor. when that hasn't been the case ever until Christ, that you take care of the poor. Ruth properly responds to Boaz's absurd kindness, falls on her face and saying, what in the world? Why would you do this? Why would you treat one like me like this? Why would you treat a foreigner like me, a Moabite like me, a homeless one, a servant girl like me with such grace and such care? So the Redeemer seeks the destitute to make them family, also saves the destitute from harm. He is protecting her. He is watching out for her. He is looking after her. He has charged his men not to touch her, not to mess with her, to draw up water for her when she is thirsty, all those things. Then look at verse 14. It goes even further. Look at 13. Then she said, I have found favor. Same word as grace, by the way. In your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants. Verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. Okay? Again, Boaz has already gone well above and beyond what was expected of Israelite farmers at the time. Just to let them glean, to take that which fell on the ground was grace, was merciful. But not just that, he allowed her to actually farm and actually be there with them and to be protected and to take whatever water she wanted. But now he invites her to his family table. He invites her literally to come to his table and to eat and take part in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers. Okay? She sat beside those who were his. And he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. When she rose to go back and glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in it until evening. The kinsman redeemer seeks the destitute. He goes after her. She didn't come to him first. He goes after her to treat her as family, saves her from any potential harm, serves the destitute at his table. Boaz welcomes Ruth around his table, and there may be there may be references there with the bread and the wine. Right? The foreshadowing of that we have in the New Testament reality of those things. Taking part in his bread, taking part in his wine. So at this point, he is not only welcoming her, but he is serving her. Right? He is serving the food to her. He is bowing down to her in that way. Just a moment ago, she was picking up scraps that the servants didn't want. She certainly doesn't deserve a spot at his table. And now not only does she have a spot at the table, but he's serving her at his table. The man who owns the field. The man whose food it is. Verse 18, which we referenced last time. And she took it up. Let's see. It was about an ephah of barley, into verse 17. And she took it up and went into the city. And her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. An ephah, to give an idea of barley, was about 30 to 50 pounds. Measurements were less exact back then. It was kind of like basketful. An ephah was between 30 and 50 pounds. A normal amount of barley to be gathered by a reaper in a day is about 2 pounds. So it's easy for us to miss, but we cannot miss this sort of abundance that we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about 25x what she would have gleaned on a normal day. Now, because of Boaz, she has gleaned 30 to 50 pounds that she is now carrying, like what's that Disney movie with the girl that's so strong? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, Encanto. What's the girl's name? Do you remember? Come on, John. I'm really relying on you because this is your spirit animal. Is this woman? Say again. Louisa. That's it. That's right. Under the Surface. Great song. Yeah. So it's just like Louisa. She carries 30 pounds of barley back to Naomi, who's expecting 1 to 2 pounds, and experiences the abundant grace of Boaz, which is the reason for this. It's fun for me imagining Naomi sitting there wallowing in her self-pity as she did, and understandably so, and then Ruth to come over the hill. And she likely would have gleaned more than that, because it talks about how hard she was working. The men keep telling Boaz she's working really hard. But of course, not anything like that without Boaz's grace towards her, mercy towards her. So we have these things all given to Ruth by the kinsman redeemer. Okay, and most of them clearly enough pointing to Christ for us, that we are the destitute, that we are the one deserving of nothing, that anything we get is by grace, that just breath we have, our lungs expanding as we sit here together is by the grace of God. We are the destitute, and that the kinsman redeemer, with all the power, with all the authority, with all the wealth, seeks us out to make us family, saves us from the harm that is due us, both by the wrath of God and by our own sin, serves us at his table, a reference to the bread and the wine, to the communion table that we are welcomed around, but also just a reference to our being welcomed as a part of his family, as a member of his household, even though we are the foreigner of foreigners, and showering us with abundant grace that doesn't really make sense, right? It's hard to even think about her carrying that much barley back. It's infinitely more hard to wrap our heads around the abundant grace that we have been shown by our kinsman redeemer. So we have the one that is our creator, who has decided to purchase us. And of course, the Redeemer must have a few things. The Redeemer must have the right to redeem. Not everyone could redeem them. You had to be a certain person in order to redeem them. Christ, being no different, had to be the one that was in the proper place to redeem. The Redeemer had to have the resources to do it. The family Redeemer and kinsman Redeemer couldn't do it if he didn't have the resources. If he didn't have the money to do it. Boaz, of course, did. Christ, of course, does. And then the family Redeemer had to want to do it. There was nothing that required the kinsman Redeemer to redeem the downtrodden people. It was like strongly encouraged sort of situation. And we see that when Boaz goes to the gate and meets with this other guy who had the option to redeem them, and he chose not to do it, and so Boaz said he would do it. In the same way, Christ, there's no rule in the Bible that said Christ had to redeem me. There's no rule that said Christ had to redeem you. And yet he chose to, of his own volition, redeem you. He chose to, of his own volition, to go to the cross. When he could have called 10,000 angels, all those things. And of course, the redemption is the sort of redemption that doesn't make sense to any onlooker. Right? You remember he goes to the gate. Boaz goes to the gate, and there's this other kinsman redeemer that's in front of him in line to purchase Naomi and Ruth and the land that goes with them. And he asks him, do you want to redeem them? Do you want to take the land and Naomi, the old widow that probably wouldn't have lived a lot longer but wouldn't have required a whole lot? And the man said, yeah, I'll redeem them. And then Boaz says, oh yeah, I forgot. By the way, there's also this young Moabite woman who you'd probably need to marry. And the man says, oh, I'm really busy today. I got to go by the bank. I got some errands to run. I got to pick up extra stuff. I'm not sure I could redeem a young Moabite woman. And so Boaz says, I'll redeem her. And everything to the contrary is shouted to Boaz, right? But Boaz, she's young. She's going to take your inheritance. She's going to outlive you. And Boaz says, well, I'll redeem her. And he said, well, but Boaz, she's a Moabite. She's a Moabite. She's not an Israelite. She's an outsider. And Boaz still says, I'll redeem her. Boaz, she has nothing. She has no dowry. She has nothing to give you. She has nothing to offer you. She brings nothing to the table. And Boaz still says, I'll redeem her. Right? It's hard to make sense of the desire of him to redeem her. And perhaps maybe Ruth is attractive, right? At least she has that and offers that to Boaz. We offer less than that to God. Right? It's this idea that we are the foreigner, the rebel against God, the one worthy of nothing, the one deserving of nothing, the one who has nothing to offer to God, who has no dowry to bring, and yet the one that God decides to redeem in a way that doesn't make any sense. And so we have this theme, which we really only see in the book of Ruth, mentioned maybe one other time, maybe one or two other times, but this Christological foreshadowing of the kinsman redeemer that only appears in this book, but that we see a lot of different angles about Christ, that we are Ruth, and that Christ, of course, being our kinsman redeemer, is Boaz. Boaz told Ruth she need not go to another table. The same thing, of course, that Christ says to us. So we go from 1 minute being nothing, being dead in our trespasses and sins, to the next, because of Christ, enjoying the feast at the Lord's table. Not because of what we have done, but because he has chosen of his own volition, of his own grace, to redeem us. Deciding not to just give us the pound of barley, but to give us 30 to 50 pounds of barley, and grace upon grace and abundance upon abundance. Look again at verse 10. The only proper response to what Christ has done for you in being your kinsman redeemer is the same response that Ruth gives again in verse 10 of chapter 2, where she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" We talked about, I think it was Sunday morning class for a couple of weeks, that the story of the prodigal son, and the difference in two brothers, that both brothers were lost at some point in this story. And both brothers wanted the father's things and not the father. Both brothers wished the father was dead so they could get the father's stuff more quickly. They didn't care really about the father. But the difference in the one who gets into the kingdom in the end and the one who doesn't is that one comes back in humility and one stands there in pride. That one comes back to the father, falls on his face, and says, I am unworthy to even be a servant of yours. And he is welcomed into the feast, and the fattened calf is killed for him. The other one has done everything right and never disobeyed, the older son says. And because of his pride, he is kept out of the kingdom. He is kept out of the feast. He's kept out of the wedding banquet. The theme we see throughout Scripture is the main difference in the one who's into heaven and the one who's not in heaven is not that one is particularly holy and one's particularly unholy. It's that one finds himself in the humble position in front of Christ, knowing all too well that they are unworthy of anything from his hand, that anything given to them is just by grace. And one has the audacity to stand there and think that they're owed something. One of the dangers of being like so many of us are and growing up in the church is being like the older brother, which I 100% was in my youth and still battle at times. But I used to read that parable of the prodigal son and just get ticked because I was the kid that was trying to do everything right, and all these other people that went off and did the wild living like the prodigal son could just come back in humility and get all the things that really deserved to me. One of the great dangers of being one that grows up as a Christian is the danger of thinking, even though you probably wouldn't say it, that God owes you something. Right? That I've lived a good life, I've done what I'm supposed to do, so because of that, God owes me heaven. God owes me a fairly good life, not too much sickness, not too much hardship, not too much suffering. God owes things to go well for me. God owes me another breath. God owes me tomorrow. God owes me to let me see my child's 10th birthday, to let me see my child's wedding. God owes me to let me see my grandchildren. And ultimately, that God owes me the gates of heaven. It is easy for that sort of idea to crop up into your heart and into our hearts. But the only proper response to God is always and forever the way that Ruth responds to Boaz, which is falling on your face, saying, "Why in the world have you treated me like this? Why in the world have you shown me such grace?" There will be no one walking through the heavenly gates, peacocking with a high chest, saying, "Man, I really did it." All of us together will be on our faces, crying out, "Why me, O Lord? Why have you shown me such grace?"